All right, let's dive into the world of Bill Gross.
The Bond King.
The Bond King, right. We're using Mary Child's biography, The Bond King.
Great book.
Yeah, to really get to know this guy. I mean, he is a legend in finance, known for, his pioneering work in active bond trading,
Yep.
and for co-founding PIMCO,
Yeah.
which became one of the world's largest investment firms. But he's a character.
What's interesting is that he really made his name in bonds,
Right.
an area of finance that in the 1970s was considered, well, kind of boring.
Yeah, bonds back then were definitely not the glamorous side of Wall Street.
Right.
But Gross saw an opportunity,
Yeah.
where others saw yawns, and he revolutionized the way people thought about bonds.
Absolutely.
And along the way, he built PIMCO into this powerhouse.
His approach was anything but conventional. He dove headfirst into this complex world of derivatives.
Okay.
He exploited these tiny pricing differences that most people ignored. And he even pulled off this legendary trade where he basically cornered the market in Ginnie Mae futures contracts.
Cornering the market. That sounds straight out of a Wall Street thriller.
It is. It's amazing. So imagine, it's 1983. Two of PIMCO's key players, Dean Miling and Pat Fisher, they're on a mission in Chicago.
Okay.
They're executing this high-stakes plan involving Ginnie Mae futures contracts. Think of futures contracts as bets on where interest rates will go in the future.
I got it.
Okay.
So what was so special about these Ginnie Mae contracts?
Yeah.
Got Bill Gross all fired up.
It all boiled down to a feature of these contracts that nobody else seemed to grasp at the time. Gross called them option-loaded. Essentially, these contracts had the potential for massive payouts if interest rates moved in a particular direction.
So it was like finding a hidden bonus level in a video game that nobody else knew about.
Exactly. And Gross, along with his team, especially an analyst named Chris Dialinas, saw this opportunity and they pounced. Over several months, they quietly started buying up these Ginnie Mae futures.
Okay.
The market, completely oblivious to what PIMCO was doing, just kept feeding their demand.
So they were playing a high-stakes game of poker, and everyone else at the table was clueless?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Eventually, other traders started realizing something was up.
Yeah.
PIMCO was buying so many of these contracts that the market was essentially drying up. Counterparties started refusing to sell to them.
That's the moment when the tension really ratchets up in those financial movies, right?
We've got it.
Yeah.
By then, PIMCO had amassed about $2 billion worth of exposure.
Wow.
A colossal gamble that could have blown up in their faces.
So did their high-stakes poker game pay off?
It did. Interest rates dropped exactly as Gross and his team had predicted. PIMCO exercised their rights within those contracts and watched the prices of those contracts skyrocket, leaving them with a massive win.
Talk about a power move. I mean, this Ginnie Mae trade must have put PIMCO on the map.
Oh, yeah.
Solidified their reputation.
Absolutely. This trade and their willingness to delve into complex areas like derivatives set the stage for PIMCO's success. It also showed everyone that Gross wasn't afraid to take calculated risks, sometimes huge ones, to get those outsized returns.
And it's incredible how he took PIMCO from this tiny, almost hidden operation within Pacific Mutual to becoming this giant in the world of finance.
And, his path to success is filled with fascinating stories. Speaking of which, you won't believe what Gross got up to during his summer break back in the 60s.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Tell me more.
Picture this. Las Vegas, summer of 1966.
Okay.
A young Bill Gross, fresh out of the Navy,
All right.
sporting a shaved head thanks to a nasty sunburn, walks into a casino. But he's not there for the usual Vegas fun. He's there to beat the house at blackjack using a technique called card counting.
Hold on, card counting?
Yeah.
Is that even legal?
It was and still is perfectly legal.
Okay.
He had learned it from a book called Beat the Dealer by Edward Thorpe.
Okay.
The book basically used math to prove that card counting could give a player an advantage in blackjack.
So he was putting theory into practice, turning himself into a human calculator at the blackjack table.
Exactly.
But Vegas is full of distractions. Could he really stay focused enough to pull it off?
He did, and I mean really focused. Gross would spend 15, sometimes even 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, sitting at those blackjack tables, meticulously counting cards. He even avoided taking breaks because he found they messed with his concentration.
Wow, that takes serious discipline. Not exactly your typical summer vacation.
No kidding. But he had a knack for it. Gross would consistently win small amounts, like $25 at a time, but it was enough to steadily build up his winnings.
This is like a scene straight out of a movie. Did the casinos ever catch on to what he was doing?
Oh, they did, and he got kicked out of several.
Really?
But he just walked down the street to the next casino and start all over again.
Wow.
He wasn't winning enough to cause them serious financial pain, but they recognized he was using a system that could threaten their odds.
Right. What did he end up doing with all that money? Did he blow it all on a celebratory trip once the summer was over?
Not quite. He was practical even back then. Gross used the $10,000 he won to pay for business school after he got back from the Navy.
See, this is what makes Bill Gross such a fascinating figure. This summer in Vegas wasn't just about gambling. It tells you a lot about him. His fascination with probabilities, his willingness to take calculated risks, his incredible discipline. These are all traits that would later define his approach to the bond market.
You're absolutely right. It's like that summer planted the seeds for his future success. Just like at the blackjack table, he learned to spot patterns, assess risks, and stay focused on the long game. He wasn't afraid to exploit inefficiencies in the market, just like he exploited the odds in Vegas.
And it paid off big time.
It did.
He went on to become the Bond King. I mean, a title that speaks volumes about his influence and success.
For sure.
But from what I've read, his rise to the top wasn't exactly a smooth ride.
Oh, no.
There were some bumps along the way, right?
His personality, as captivating as it could be, would also play a major role in his eventual downfall.
All right, well, before we get to the drama,
Okay.
let's rewind a bit and talk about the rise of the Bond King. How did he go from counting cards in Vegas to becoming this most influential figure in the bond market?
In the early days, it was all about performance.
Okay.
Under Gross's leadership, PIMCO started delivering exceptional returns for its clients, consistently beating the market.
Okay.
Remember, this was back when bond trading was still a relatively niche area, not a lot of excitement there.
So they were like the early adopters, the pioneers of modern bond trading.
Exactly. They were innovating, coming up with the new strategies, and shaking things up in a world that had been pretty sleepy for a long time. And as PIMCO's success attracted more clients, Gross's reputation as someone who could almost magically predict market trends started to grow.
He became like the oracle of the bond market, a guy everyone looked to for guidance.
Precisely. And he used that influence to actually shape the dynamics of the market. He wasn't just reacting to what was happening. He was influencing it. A good example of this is what happened during the Mexican peso crisis in the mid-90s.
Oh, right. That was a major financial earthquake. That really rattled the global markets.
Yeah.
What was Gross's play during that crisis?
Well, the Mexican government was in deep trouble. The peso was plummeting, and they were on the verge of defaulting on their debts. Investors were panicking, dumping their Mexican bonds like they were hot potatoes.
Except Bill Gross. I bet he probably saw this as an opportunity.
You read his mind. While everyone else was running for the exits, Gross, with his trademark boldness, decided to buy a big chunk of those Mexican bonds. It was a contrarian move.
Yeah.
The kind that had become his signature.
That was a huge risk, though, wasn't it?
Huge.
What made him so confident that it would pay off?
He was convinced, and correctly so, that a bailout was imminent. He figured that the U.S. government and the International Monetary Fund wouldn't let Mexico completely collapse.
So he was betting on a government rescue.
And he nailed it. The U.S., along with the IMF, stepped in with a massive rescue package. The Mexican bond market stabilized, and Gross's gamble paid off big time.
Another big win for the Bond King.
Yes.
He had a knack for finding those high-stakes situations.
He did, where others saw only danger.
Yes.
And turning them into profitable opportunities.
He did. But that same audacity, combined with his very unique personality, would eventually lead to some serious trouble. It's like the higher he climbed, the harder the potential fall became.
Okay, before we dive into all that,
Okay.
let's take a closer look at the culture at PIMCO.
Yeah.
What was it like working there?
Yeah.
From what I've read, it wasn't exactly known for being laid back and casual.
Intense is probably an understatement.
Okay.
PIMCO was known for its grow or die mentality, this relentless drive for performance and profits. It was a high-pressure environment, to say the least.
Sounds like a pressure cooker.
Yeah.
Did that environment bring out the best in people?
In some ways it did. It attracted some of the most brilliant minds in finance, all driven to succeed.
Right.
But it also fostered a culture of fear and paranoia.
And at the center of it all was Bill Gross.
Yeah.
What was he like as a boss? Let me put it this way. Imagine a workplace where silence was the golden rule, where even talking about investments could get you in trouble.
Seriously. You're kidding, right? That sounds more like a library than a trading floor.
No, I'm serious. Gross demanded absolute focus, and any distractions, even a simple conversation, were met with disapproval.
Wow.
There are stories about him reprimanding employees for trivial things like incorrect page numbering in presentations.
Wow. Sounds like he ruled with an iron fist.
He did.
What about his relationships with his colleagues? Was he much of a team player?
That wasn't exactly his strong suit. He had a reputation for being cold, distant, even confrontational at times. There's this infamous story about a dinner where one of his partners, Bill Thompson, actually encouraged the managing directors to get it all out by calling Gross an asshole.
Whoa, that's pretty revealing. That paints a stark picture of what it was like inside PMZ.
It does. And as PMCO grew in size and influence, so did the internal pressures and conflicts. This intense, almost toxic environment, combined with Gross's increasingly unpredictable behavior, would eventually lead to some major cracks in his seemingly invincible facade.
So the seeds of his downfall were sown during his rise to the top.
It seems that way.
Fascinating how success can sometimes contain the elements of its own destruction.
Yeah.
But I guess we'll have to wait for the next part of our deep dive to uncover how it all came crashing down. So we've established that Bill Gross built this incredibly successful but also incredibly intense culture at PMCO. It makes you wonder how sustainable that kind of environment really is in the long run.
You've hit on a key point. As PMCO kept growing, there was this looming question of who would eventually succeed Bill Gross.
Right.
He wasn't getting any younger, and investors were starting to worry about what would happen to the firm without its star player at the helm.
It's the classic succession problem. The kind that keeps boards of directors up at night. But at PMMCO, with Gross's outsized personality and control over everything, the stakes were even higher.
Oh, yeah?
So who did they have in mind to fill those incredibly large shoes?
Well, in 2007, they managed to recruit Mohammed El-Arian,
Okay.
a highly respected economist who had been making waves at the International Monetary Fund.
Right.
He was seen as the heir apparent, the guy who could bring stability and a fresh perspective to PMCO.
El-Arian had a stellar reputation.
He did.
I mean, he was even being considered for the top job at the IMF.
That's right.
What convinced him to join PMCO?
Gross himself played a big role in convincing him. They met at this fancy hotel in Laguna Beach, and Gross, in his own somewhat awkward way, popped the question.
Okay.
Would you consider coming back to PMCO?
Hmm.
El-Arian had actually worked at PMCO briefly back in the 90s.
Oh, okay.
So he was intrigued.
So they saw him as the solution to their succession puzzle.
Yeah.
Did it work out the way they had hoped?
Not exactly. While El-Arian was brilliant and had a ton of experience, he and Gross were like oil and water when it came to their personalities and how they managed people. This clash became more and more apparent as they tried to work together.
It's almost like a recipe for conflict. You've got these two strong personalities trying to share the same space.
Right.
What were some of the key differences between them that caused friction?
Well, Gross thrived in a culture of fear and intimidation, as we've discussed.
Right.
He was notorious for his outbursts, his demanding nature, and his complete intolerance for anyone who disagreed with him. El-Arian, on the other hand, was much more collaborative and diplomatic in his approach.
So they were operating on completely different wavelengths.
Right.
Did this tension impact their work? I mean, could they still function effectively as a team?
It definitely created this underlying unease within the firm.
Mm-hmm.
Employees felt caught in the middle, not sure who to please or how to navigate this power struggle that was playing out right above them.
It doesn't sound like a very healthy work environment.
It wasn't.
But did it impact their performance? Were they still delivering results for their clients?
Surprisingly, at least initially, it didn't seem to hurt their performance. In fact, PIMCO navigated the 2008 financial crisis remarkably well, due in part to their foresight and contrarian bets.
Ah, the 2008 crisis. That was a defining moment for the entire financial world.
It was.
And PIMCO was right in the thick of it.
Yeah.
Tell me more about how they handled that tumultuous period.
Well, if you recall, one of PIMCO's economists, Paul McCulley, had been warning about the dangers of the shadow banking system long before the crisis hit.
Oh, wow.
His insights proved incredibly valuable when things started to unravel.
He was like the Cassandra of the financial world, predicting the doom that everyone else ignored.
You could say that. His warnings, combined with Gross's sharp market instincts, allowed PMCO to anticipate the housing bubble bursting and position themselves accordingly.
So they saw it coming while most others were caught completely off guard.
Exactly. They started reducing their exposure to those risky mortgage-backed securities well before the market crash.
Yeah.
When the crisis hit, they were ready to capitalize on the chaos.
So while other firms were scrambling just to survive, PIMCO was scooping up bargains.
They were.
And profiting from the turmoil. That sounds very much in line with Bill Gross's style.
It was a classic example of their contrarian approach.
Hmm.
They even set up a war room.
A war room.
Yeah.
That sounds intense.
To strategize and monitor the crisis as it unfolded.
Were they expecting an all-out financial war?
They were definitely preparing for a worst-case scenario, and they wanted to be ready to jump on any opportunities that might arise.
Yeah.
Don't forget their motto was grow or die.
Right.
And even in a crisis, they saw potential for growth.
So how exactly did they grow during this time? Were they buying up those distressed assets that everyone else was afraid to touch?
Exactly. They strategically invested in things that were considered toxic by most other firms. Things like debt backed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, believing that the government would eventually have to step in and bail them out.
They were betting on government intervention. Did that gamble pay off?
It did. The government did indeed step in, and PIMCO walked away with enormous profits. They made other bold moves as well, like buying up billions of dollars worth of notes from troubled banks like Wachovia and Bank of America, betting on their eventual recovery.
So they were profiting from the very crisis.
Yes.
That was crippling so many other institutions. That's got to be a bit controversial, right?
There were criticisms, of course, about them profiting from a crisis
Right.
that was causing so much pain and hardship for so many people.
It's that age-old debate.
Yeah.
Are these investors vultures preying on weakness, or are they saviors helping to stabilize the system?
Right. It's a complex issue.
Yeah.
But for PIMCO, it was ultimately about maximizing returns for their clients. And there's no denying they were incredibly successful at it.
Yeah.
Their performance during the crisis cemented Bill Gross's reputation as the bond king.
So they came out of the crisis stronger than ever. But what about the tension between Gross and L-Arian? Did the crisis bring them closer together, or did it just make things worse?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's clear that the power struggle between them continued. And as Gross's behavior became increasingly erratic, the cracks in their relationship and within PIMCO itself started to widen.
It sounds like the seeds of his eventual downfall were sown during this period of incredible success. It's almost Shakespearean, a tale of hubris and the corrupting influence of power. But how did it all actually come crashing down? What was the trigger?
There wasn't one single event. It was more like a series of increasingly strange and damaging incidents that ultimately led to his dramatic exit from PIMCO.
Okay, lay it on me. What was the first domino to fall?
It all started with a speech, actually,
Right.
a very strange and awkward speech.
Right, now you've got my attention. What was so strange about this speech?
It was May of 2009, and Gross was in Chicago to deliver the keynote address at the prestigious Morningstar Investment Conference. He had just been named Fixed Income Manager of the Decade. He was at the pinnacle of his career.
He was on top of the world. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, instead of giving this triumphant victory speech, Gross used the platform to launch into this bizarre and rambling rant. He talked about needing more equity analysts, even though he had just hired Neil Kashkari to build an equities business.
Wait, wasn't Kashkari the guy who was overseeing the TARP bailout program?
Yes.
What was he doing at PIMCO?
That's a story for another time.
Okay.
The point is that Gross's outburst at the Morningstar conference left people baffled and concerned. It was one of the first public signs that something was off.
So this speech was a bit of a red flag. Did things settle down after that?
Not really. His behavior became more and more unpredictable. He started making some truly outlandish statements in his investment outlooks, those monthly newsletters he sent to clients.
His investment outlooks were legendary. They were this unique blend of market insights and very personal anecdotes.
They were?
What kind of outlandish statements was he making?
Well, in one, he went on about his dead cat Bob and how she used to watch him on TV and even when he was in the shower. In another, he talked about the erotic nature of sneezing.
Okay, that's definitely crossing into bizarre territory. It sounds like he was losing his filter. Did anyone try to rein him in? Did anyone say, Bill, maybe tone it down a bit?
L-Arian, being co-CIO, definitely tried to manage the situation, but it became increasingly difficult. Gross simply wasn't receptive to any kind of criticism or suggestions.
He was used to having absolute control. It must have been hard for him to share power, especially when his behavior was becoming so erratic. Did this tension ultimately lead to L-Arian's departure?
It was definitely a major factor. L-Arian was tired of constantly cleaning up Gross's messes and dealing with his unpredictable behavior. He wanted to create a more stable and collaborative environment, which seemed impossible with Gross at the helm.
So he decided he'd had enough and jumped ship. When did this happen?
In January of 2014, L-Arian abruptly resigned, citing personal reasons. But everyone knew that behind the scenes, it was a clear sign that trouble was brewing at PIMCO.
This must have been a huge blow to PIMCO.
It was.
I mean, Illyrian was their star player, their carefully chosen successor.
Right.
How did Gross react to his departure?
He was devastated, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of reflecting on his own role in Illyrian's decision, Gross became consumed by paranoia. He was convinced that someone was leaking information to the press, trying to sabotage him. He became obsessed with finding the source of these leaks.
Paranoia and an inability to accept responsibility, that's a dangerous combination. Did this paranoia start to affect his behavior even more?
Absolutely. He became even more controlling and confrontational, clashing with other executives, demanding absolute loyalty, and isolating himself from anyone who dared to question him.
He was pushing away potential allies and creating enemies. It sounds like a classic self-destructive spiral. Did anyone try to intervene to get him to see what he was doing to himself and to the company?
The PIMCO Executive Committee, led by Doug Hodge, definitely tried to reason with him, but their efforts were futile. Gross was convinced he was the victim of some grand conspiracy and refused to listen to any criticism.
He was digging his own grave, metaphorically speaking, of course. Did this paranoia lead to any specific incidents that really stand out?
Oh, there were several. One particularly damaging episode involved a senior executive named Andrew Balls.
Okay.
Gross became convinced that Balls was leaking information to the press and tried to force him to resign.
What evidence did he have for this? Was there any real proof?
It was mainly based on suspicion and circumstantial evidence. Gross saw Balls as an ally of Illyrian's and believed he was part of some plot to undermine him.
So it was more about a personal vendetta than any real evidence of wrongdoing? How did the executive committee handle this?
They were very alarmed by Gross's behavior. They confronted him and pointed out that he didn't actually have the authority to force anyone to resign.
They were trying to protect the company from his erratic actions, but how did Gross react to being called out like that?
He denied that he was trying to force Balls out, claiming he had simply asked him to consider resigning. But the committee didn't buy it. They had witnessed his pattern of intimidation and bullying firsthand.
It was pretty clear he was lying, that his paranoia was spiraling out of control. Did this incident lead to any real consequences for Gross?
It was a turning point. The executive committee realized that Gross was no longer fit to lead PIMCO. He had become a liability, and his behavior was threatening the company's stability and reputation.
So what did they do? Did they confront him again? Did they try to stage some kind of intervention?
They decided they needed to take a more drastic step.
Okay.
They called a secret meeting to discuss his future at the firm.
Oh.
And Bill Gross was not invited.
Okay, the stage is set for a showdown. What happened at this secret meeting? What was the verdict?
They decided that Gross had to go.
Wow.
They couldn't risk keeping him at the helm any longer. They knew it was going to be a messy and difficult process, but they were prepared to face the consequences.
This was a bold move.
It was.
They were essentially dethroning the Bond King. But how did they plan to actually make this happen?
They initially wanted to give him a chance to resign gracefully to save face. They drafted a plan for his smooth transition, hoping he would accept it.
That was a risky gamble. They were betting that his ego wouldn't allow him to put up a fight.
You're right. It was a risky strategy. But they had to try. They had to protect PIMCO.
So they presented him with this plan. How did he react?
Let's just say it didn't go as smoothly as they'd hoped. In fact, it led to a dramatic confrontation that would change the entire landscape of the bond market forever.
I can't wait to hear what happened. But I guess we'll have to wait for the final part of our deep dive to get the full story.
It's Friday, September 26th, 2014.
Okay.
Bill Gross walks into this meeting with the executive committee fully expecting to discuss his carefully crafted transition plan, a plan that he believes will allow him to retain some control to salvage his ego. But he's walking into a trap.
This is it, the moment of truth. What happened when he entered that room?
Doug Hodge, the CEO, took charge and presented Gross with a completely different plan. One where he would announce his retirement at the end of the year, a carefully orchestrated exit designed to minimize the damage to PIMCO.
It was a forced retirement.
Right.
Disguised as a graceful exit. How did Gross take it?
He was livid. He felt betrayed, humiliated. This was not the negotiation he had in mind. He flat out refused to accept their terms, seeing it as a direct insult to his legacy.
So the Bond King wasn't going down without a fight. What did he do next?
He stormed out of the meeting, leaving the executive committee in shock, scrambling to figure out how to contain the fallout. Gross, still reeling from the confrontation, knew he had to act quickly. He reached out to Jeffrey Gunlock, his arch-rival in the bond market and the founder of Double Line Capital.
Gundlach, the guy who had been publicly challenging Gross's dominance for years.
The one and only.
Why would he turn to his competitor?
Desperate times call for desperate measures. Gross saw Gundlach as someone who understood the pressures and complexities of their world, someone who might be sympathetic to his situation. He was hoping to find a safe landing spot at Double Line, a place where he could continue to manage money and prove that he still had what it took.
So he was seeking refuge with his enemy. Did Gundlach welcome him with open arms?
Not quite. They had a productive conversation, but Gundlach made it clear that there was no way he was going to share leadership. Gross would be welcome to join as a portfolio manager, but not as an equal partner.
It must have been a humbling proposition.
It was.
For the Bond King to even consider.
Yeah.
Did he accept?
He wasn't ready to give up that level of control just yet. He still believed he could negotiate a better exit from PIMCO, one that would allow him to hold on to some of his power and influence.
So he went back to the negotiating table. What happened during this round of talks?
He reached out to a member of PIMCO's board, hoping to find someone who might be sympathetic to his position. They discussed a revised transition plan, one that would allow Gross to step down from his leadership roles but still manage a smaller portfolio. It was a compromise, a way for him to save face.
It sounds like he was trying to find a way to have his cake and eat it too.
He was.
Did PIMCO accept his proposal?
They did not.
Right.
They were done with him. They had lost faith in his ability to lead and were determined to move forward without him. When Gross met with Hodge and Jacobs again, they presented him with their final offer, a carefully managed retirement announcement at the end of the year with no possibility of staying on in any capacity.
A complete and utter rejection. How did he handle that?
He was crushed. The reality of the situation finally hit him. His reign at PIMCO was over. He had lost his kingdom, his power, his legacy. It was a bitter pill to swallow.
It must have been a devastating blow for someone who was so accustomed to winning, to being in control. What did he do next?
He had one last card to play. While the executive committee was busy preparing for their quarterly cyclical forum, a big gathering of PIMCO's top investment professionals, Gross was quietly making his own plans for escape.
Escape? He was just going to walk away without a fight.
He knew that fighting was pointless at this point. He had lost the support of the board, the executive committee, even some of his closest allies. He decided to leave on his own terms before they could formally fire him.
So how did he orchestrate this exit? Did he just slip out the back door?
He went to his office, packed up his belongings, and walked out of PIMCO for the last time. A few hours later, he sent an email to Janus Henderson, a rival investment firm, announcing that he was joining them.
Wait, Janus Henderson? That was a much smaller firm compared to PIMCO. What was he thinking?
It was definitely a step down, but for Gross it represented a fresh start, a chance to rebuild his reputation to prove all his doubters wrong.
So the Bond King had been dethroned, but he wasn't quite ready to abdicate. He was starting a new chapter. How did the financial world react to this whole drama?
It sent shockwaves through the market. PIMCO, which had once seemed like an unstoppable force, was suddenly looking vulnerable. Investors pulled billions of dollars out of their funds worried about the future without Gross leading the way.
This was a major turning point, both for PIMCO and for the bond market as a whole. What happened to Gross at Janus Henderson? Did he manage to regain his former glory?
He tried. He launched a new bond fund, and he made some bold predictions, but he never quite reached the same level of influence he had at PIMCO. He eventually retired from Janus Henderson in 2019.
So the Bond King's reign came to an end, not with a bang, but more of a whimper. What can we learn from his story?
Bill Gross's story is a fascinating and cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ego and the importance of adapting to change. He was undeniably brilliant, a true visionary who transformed the way people think about bond trading. But his flaws, his paranoia, his inability to let go of control, those ultimately led to his downfall.
It's a reminder that even the most successful people are not immune to human weaknesses. Sometimes our strengths can become our weaknesses if we're not careful.
Exactly. A complex story full of triumphs and tragedies, one that continues to fascinate and intrigue people in the financial world. It's a story that reminds us that even kings can fall.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and times of Bill Gross, the Bond King. It's been a wild ride. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those questions coming.